species out here. Um, Response to mitigation actions should not only be focused on anthropocentric activities and on us. So in this plenary session, we bring in the presentation and discussion encompassing the nature and natural ecosystems that help us balance and support life and the survival on this planet. With this, I would like to introduce today's panelists. So we have Professor Tomoko Hasegawa, and then online we will have Professor PAULA Harrison and Professor Nicola Ranger. So I'll just start with the introduction. So first we have Professor PAULA Harrison, a principal natural capital scientist, professor of land and water modeling at the UK Center of Ecology and Hydrology. She currently co-chairs the Intergovernmental Panel on Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems, the IPBES. Then we have Professor Tomoko Hasegawa. She is an IIM modeler with expertise in AFLU and relevant sectors. She serves as a professor at Ritsumeikan University and has been selected as a lead author in the IPCC AR7 Working Group 3, Chapter 3 on scenarios. And finally, we have Professor Nicola Ranger, Executive Director of Earth Capital Nexus, and Professor in Practice of Natural Capital Risk and Finance at the Grantham Research Institute in the London School of Economics and Political Science. She leads the interdisciplinary research and policy engagement at the nexus of finance, investment, natural capital, resilience, and sustainable development with a global focus. So with this, I think first we will have Professor PAULA. She would be presenting on the latest developments in IPBES and how we can collaborate with the current IPCC AR7 focus. So, PAULA, are you there?
Great. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm just going to share my screen, just one moment. Can I check that you can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. As mentioned, I'm going to talk about sort of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and particularly sort of focus on opportunities around knowledge gaps identified in IPBES assessments related to scenarios and modeling, but also opportunities related around bringing the biodiversity and climate scenario modeling communities together. So just first, for those of you who may be less familiar with IPBES, it's very similar to the IPCC, but this focus on biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's younger. It was established by governments in 2012, currently has 152 government members, and its mission is to strengthen knowledge foundations for better policy through science for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, long-term human well-being and sustainable development. And to date, it's produced 13 assessments, which are illustrated on this slide. It tends to divide assessments into two types. It has methodological assessments, and an example of that is our 2016 methodological assessment on scenarios and models of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And then it also has thematic assessments. And one of the sort of most well-known of our thematic assessment was the first global assessment that was published in 2019. And one of the most recent ones is the Nexus assessment on the interlinkages among biodiversity, water, food, health, and climate change that I had the privilege to co-chair. So I want to just then sort of zoom in a little bit more on the methodological assessment that we published on scenarios and models, because this sort of had some conclusions that that sort of underpinned some of the development around scenario modelling related to the IPBES platform. So what this methodological assessment found was that there are lots of really useful scenarios available out there for policy support, but most of the global scenarios are currently being developed for other purposes, and principally that has been for climate change and looking at climate change impacts, more recently also, of course, for mitigation and adaptation. It was also noticed that a lot of global scenarios lack a participatory approach, again, because that is quite difficult to do. But the key outcome from that assessment was that there are few scenarios available that really detail these nature positive futures. And because what we found from the scenario literature is that most global scenarios are more limited to looking at nature as the end point of different scenarios. So we look at impacts on nature, and often many of those scenarios are negative. What the report also showed is that global scenarios tend to also be a bit limited in the range of policy and management responses that relate to nature that can be represented. And it was building on these key findings that a few years later, the IPBES put together an expert group to understand how it could fill this knowledge gap. And that turned into an IPBES task force called the Scenarios and Models Task Force. And collectively, this expert group, followed by the task force, developed the Nature's Futures framework. This is illustrated on this slide, and the framework overall aims to support the development of sort of positive or desirable futures for nature and people. And the underlying assumption behind it is that nature's valued more in the future, but the reasons why it's valued, those underlying value perspectives, can vary wildly. So what the framework is depicted as is this triangle, which is shown on the left-hand side of the slide, where each corner illustrates an orientation towards one of three value perspectives, and they are based on the relationship between humans and nature. So they vary between an intrinsic value perspective, which is known as the nature for nature value perspective, a relational value perspective, which is known as nature as culture, and this more instrumental value perspective known as nature for society. And the space within that triangle is really represented as this continuum. So it's a gradient where these three value perspectives exist together, and it highlights that they're not mutually exclusive. And then the lines around the outside of that triangle indicate this boundary between desirable versus undesirable futures. So overall, the framework really was built to allow those involved in scenarios building to recognize and better address in a more explicit way the plural values that are ascribed to nature and ecosystem services, or nature's contributions to people, which more conventional scenario building methods have often failed to capture. So what happened then was IPBES member governments welcomed the Nature's Futures framework in its 9th plenary session that took place in 2022. And as part of that, it also welcomed the methodological guidelines, which are available on the IPBES website. And then there were a few recommendations that were encouraging governments and other experts to test the Nature's Futures framework and apply it in different situations. So what's happened since it was welcomed is that the biodiversity and ecosystem service community has been testing the application of that framework in different regions and contexts. And those publications from that process are now really starting to increase rapidly in the sort of scientific literature. An illustration of this is a paper that was published this year that was published by authors that are members of the IPBES Task Force on Scenarios and Models, and they reviewed 31 of the studies that sort of existed up to around 2024, sort of showing that these studies are quite widely distributed across the globe. And in addition to the different focus of those studies, the IPBES Task Force on Scenarios Modelling has also been creating this community of practice to move the coordination of applications of this new scenario framework away from IPBES and out into the community. So again, there is a real call there for people to get involved in this community of practice and to sort of help exchange learnings of experience and to help raise awareness of this new scenario framework. So what I want to do in the rest of my presentation is now sort of focus more on forward-looking. So in terms of how the IEM community can sort of contribute and link to IPBES assessments in the future. And a key way to do this is really to understand both knowledge gaps from previous assessments, but also how those knowledge gaps are relevant to the forthcoming assessments from IPBES. And we have a number of currently ongoing IPBES assessments. There's 4 of them. There's a business and biodiversity assessment and a monitoring biodiversity assessment. They're both very close to completion, so it's kind of too late to input both of those. But there is a spatial planning and connectivity assessment and the second global assessment, and both of those have commenced more recently. So there is still time to provide input to both of those because we're not yet at their cut-off date for publications. I wanted just to focus in a little bit more on the second global assessment as probably the most relevant to the community here, and particularly on its chapter 4, which is called Future Pathways. And again, here looking the indicative timing for this particular assessment, the cut-off date for new publications being incorporate is probably going to be in the beginning of its final external review period, which is estimated to be the second quarter of 2027. So still plenty of time for communities to get together, publish papers that can then be pulled in and cited into this report. The scoping of this report outlines some of the key studies that the experts involved in this chapter will be looking for. And here we can see this focus on positive and transformative pathways, including applications of nature's futures framework, but also other sustainability orientated scenarios, such as the socioeconomic pathways. There's also sort of a request for scenarios and modelling studies that represent interactions and synergies, particularly again here between climate change and biodiversity, but also with wider sectors to capture nexus interactions. A request for work that really provides information on urgency and pace of action, and then work that represents the perspectives of Indigenous peoples and local communities and their issues of concern regarding future pathways. And because this scoping has happened, a lot of the biodiversity and ecosystem service community are very aware and have been for some time that they need to get together. And we see various initiatives and consortia now working towards developing new modelling work that will then hopefully be cited within the second global assessment. And on this slide, I've just put a few acronyms for some of them. So BESSIM is probably one of the key modelling communities where we have some integrated assessment modelers involved in that, but also many modelers related to biodiversity and ecosystem services. This community also got together for the first global assessment and had a major input into the chapters on scenarios and pathways, including having a major figure in the summary for policymakers. But there are also many other initiatives getting together, like BioFutures, EcoCode, Bending the Curve, which I think Tomoko is going to talk about more following me, and of course, initiatives that already exist that are highly relevant called SHAPE. And many of these are developing these more positive futures, these more sustainability orientated futures, some involving the Nature's Futures framework. So again, I just want to finish with a couple of slides that now really sort of emphasize more those knowledge gaps that, again, we would really welcome new studies on. And this relates to sort of the scoping and the needs of these forthcoming assessments. So there is one around really this focus on developing and simulating these target-seeking scenarios that identify these feasible pathways to sustainability. So again, not just a focus on business as usual or exploratory projections, but recognizing that they will still have a role to play in these future assessments. A focus on application of nexus approaches, so the importance of taking systems approaches in modelling frameworks, very important and relevant to the IEM community, but really here this focus around improving representation of cross-sector and cross-realm interactions and feedbacks. We really need more efforts to improve the number and diversity of response options, particularly those related to nature that can be represented within models, including interactions between the response options and what that does mean for synergies, trade-offs, and also the identification of unintended consequences. And then, of course, around work around leveraging emerging technologies to both improve modelling of complex system interactions as well as transformative pathways, more studies that help to represent these diverse worldviews and knowledge systems, and very important then in the final bullet point to really link these scenario modelling studies to policy frameworks, but not just to individual policy frameworks, to look at how response options can help move us towards multiple policy frameworks at the same time. So how they can help alignment between, for example, the Paris Agreement, the coming multi-lateral global biodiversity framework, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So just to conclude, again, I want to just again emphasize something that I'm sure you're all aware of, that our global crises are deeply interconnected, and hence we should not be studying these crises in isolation from each other. We need scenario modelling studies that capture the interlinkages between biodiversity, climate, and other systems to provide this holistic policy support that is needed in these major intergovernmental assessments such as IPCC and IPBES. And I think this is a real opportunity for researchers such as yourselves and others to really foster collaboration between IPCC and IPBES experts, including, again, this movement towards more holistic scenario frameworks. And I know there's some discussion in how to move that forwards in the ICONIC steering committee. But also, this is also being encouraged by both platforms. We do see key figures from both platforms attending each other's meetings. And here I just want to highlight again, there's a plan to organise an expert workshop on biodiversity and climate change in the second half of 2026 in support of the second global assessment. And again, this is currently being planned through IPBES, but hopefully we want to coordinate it also with the IPCC. So please watch this space for more opportunities as they arise. And with that, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Paula. And without much ado, I would invite Tomoko to please present her on mitigation and land-based CDR.
So thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm Tomoko Hasegawa from Ritsumeikan University. So it's very honored to be here. I talked in the speech in the Brazil, which is very important country for the biodiversity protection as well as the climate mitigations. So I would like to say thank you for our IMC steering committee members to give this opportunity. So today I would like to introduce biodiversity related researches from the climate mitigation perspectives. So as you may know, climate change affects many sectors, and then biodiversity is no exceptions. So this figure shows the result of the BESIM-1, which was a joint study between the biodiversity modeling community as well as IIMA communities. And these two panels shows two scenarios with and without climate change impact on the biodiversity. And we can see that the large biodiversity loss in the scenario is including the climate change impact compared to the without climate change impact. So this means that the climate change impact is quite large, and then even larger than that the land use change impact only. And another joint study between the biodiversity modeling community and the IIMA community was bending the curve, as already Paula mentioned. And in this study, we assumed the three measures. First is biodiversity protection, and then sustainability, food consumption and production. And we assume these effort and policies in the IMs, and then produce the future land use map, and then provide it into the biodiversity models. And then they provided the biodiversity indicators. The results show that if we do not do any policy and effort, then this decline of the biodiversity loss will continue in the future. And then if we do some additional effort, then this recovered. But important things is integrating all effort and policy is needed to recover this biodiversity to the current level by the end of the century. And no single policy and effort is sufficient. And integrating all effort and policies are essential. And to avoid such a climate impact on the biodiversity, climate mitigation is very important. And we already had many great presentations in the yesterday, so I don't go in detail, but briefly. So to achieve the long-term climate goals, so we need to achieve the net negative emissions in the the latter of this century, and around the 5 to 9 gigaton CO2 annual carbon removal is likely needed throughout the centuries. And to achieve such a carbon removal, large-scale carbon dioxide removal will be likely needed. And in the previous studies in the IPCC AR6 cycles, most study depending as considered as afforestation and reforestation and bioenergy plus CCS as major options for these CDR technologies. But these technologies raise concerns about the land sustainability. Here I give one example of the trade-off between the biodiversity protection and climate mitigation. So this figure shows the relationship between the biodiversity and then potential bioenergy supply. So we can see that if biodiversity increase, then potential bioenergy supply is decreased. So this means that reducing the dependence on the land-based option is very important to balancing these two goals. It means achieving the biodiversity protections and then climate mitigation simultaneously. And at the time, we had a question like, okay, whether the climate mitigation is truly beneficial for the biodiversity or not, because their land-based mitigation is harmful, can be harmful to the biodiversity. So to answer these questions, we compared the two scenarios. So we investigated both effects of the climate change and climate mitigations on the biodiversity. And the results show that climate mitigation is still beneficial for the biodiversity. Even climate mitigation rely on land-based options. This is because climate change impact on the biodiversity is very large. So benefit of avoiding such climate impact is still larger than the negative impact of the land-based CDR, land-based options. So, and importantly, this benefit of the climate mitigation occurs globally, but the negative impact of the land-based options is occurred only in the specific region, such as Latin America or Southeast Asia. So this may result in the regional disparities or inequalities in the environmental burden. Then, and then we had the next question like, okay, which is better for the biodiversity, afforestation or BECCS? So to answer this question, we compared the two scenarios. One is achieving the long-term target only with BECCS, and the other is only with afforestation. So these results show that only rely on the afforestation required 2 to 3 times more wider land is required compared to the mitigation only rely on the BECCS. Because this is because carbon uptake per unit area of the bioenergy crop is 3 times higher than that of afforestation. So this two scenario is very hypothetical because achieving only with one single technologies, but this study shows that land efficiency of the carbon removal is very crucial to be balancing to these goals. So achieving climate mitigation and then biodiversity protection at the same time. And here is a impact on the biodiversity. And we can see that also if climate mitigation rely on the afforestation, require a large area, and then lead a greater negative impact on biodiversity. And then we had the next question. Okay, next is which is better for the biodiversity? Land-based options or non-land-based CDR? Because there is a growing interest on the CDR options that do not require the additional land. For example, ducks or enhanced weathering. So to answer this question, we compare the two scenarios. One is a conventional mitigation scenario, which rely on the BECCS and the afforestation mainly, and the other is introduce more various CDR options, including ducks and enhanced weathering. And this is our result of the land use. So we can see that shifting to the non-land-based CDR options greatly reduce the land needed for the bioenergy and afforestation. So land area for the CDR technologies is become 1/3 in the case of the mitigation with non-land-based CDRs. And this slide shows the result on the biodiversity. Interestingly, that the effect of shifting to the non-land CDR options differs across indicators. We can see the BII didn't improve, but species richness estimated by AIM Bio is greatly improved. And this differences is because these two indicators value the afforestation differently. So BII evaluate the afforestation is very benefit for biodiversity, but for species richness, it's more evaluate, put a high value on the existing habitat in non-forest area. That's why converting non-forest area to the forest area is harmful to the biodiversity. So, so we can see there uncertainty across the indicators, but still we can see the agreement on this shifting to the non-land-based CDR option is don't harm to the biodiversity. So as a summary, so first, climate change can severely affect the biodiversity. And to avoid this, climate mitigation measures provide benefits for the biodiversity, even when they involve the land use changes. And non-land-based mitigation option can be beneficial biodiversity, but it poses cost-related challenges because the ducks or other non-land CDR option is high cost. And lastly is impact of afforestation and reforestation is still uncertain across indicators, depending on what the indicators value. And then also types and the location of the forest are different differently evaluated. So future research is needed. So that's all from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tomoko. And now finally, we'll have Nicola presenting the user perspective, so policymakers and stakeholders from finance. Nicola, you have the floor.
Hello, hi, good morning or good afternoon to colleagues as well. I'm Nicola Ranger, so I'm based at the London School of Economics, and I'm going to, as we've just heard, talk about the user perspective. I'm going to particularly talk about the finance perspective. So let me share my slides. So to give you a bit of background, I sort of spent the early years of my career in working in integrated assessment modeling, particularly sort of working. Can you see that, or is it or
No,
not?
yeah.
Why is that not working? Let me try again. Yeah, so I spent the early years of my career working in integrated assessment modeling, particularly sort of looking at sort of the economic impacts of climate change and different mitigation pathways. And then throughout my career, I focused more on issues around adaptation. And then
We still can't see your slides. So if you are you sharing your screen?
yeah, it says I'm screen sharing.
Because we can't see your slides yet.
Let me try a slightly different way.
Okay. We could see it previously, but I think.
Okay, I think it might be because I'm on two screens. It might be, maybe let me try again now.
Okay, we can, and maybe you
Great.
could do it in presenter mode. Yeah, thank you. Yes, now we can see it.
Great. Fantastic. Yeah. So as I was saying, I started in integrated assessment modeling, but sort of very quickly moved into working in policy, first on climate change, but then more recently on nature. So I'm going to give a perspective, particularly about how integrated assessment models are used in finance, particularly in one area, greening finance, and I'll explain what that is for those of you that may not be familiar. And then specifically in the area of nature, which is what I focus on today. So to give you a bit of background, and I'm sure you've all seen these very famous plots before around the planetary boundaries. So we know that climate change is only one of 9 planetary boundaries, and I think all of us here speaking to you today particularly are interested in what's the relationship between climate and those other boundaries and human activities. So what we know is that ecosystem services have been eroding at an unprecedented rate. So I've got here one of the key stats from the last IPBES global assessment that 14 of the 18 ecosystem services have been declining since the 1970s. And what my work is about is looking at how does that then lead to financial risks and economic risks. So how does that change the underpinnings, foundation, including water, soils, pollinators on which our economies depend, and how does that translate into financial risks? And you'll all be aware, I'm sure, that alongside the Paris Agreement on climate change a couple of years ago, back in 2022, there was a first global agreement around a set of targets for alleviating biodiversity loss. And this shows those key targets, but I'm going to particularly focus on those ones around finance. So you can see sort of around goal number 18, for example, around reducing subsidies for nature damaging activities, 19 on sort of mobilizing more financial resources into nature. So that's what I'm going to particularly focus on here. And the numbers that kind of keep me awake at night in the work that I do are these ones. So at the moment, if you look around the world, sort of what is being financed related to nature, we know that there's around 7 trillion financial flows going into things that are destroying nature in some way, and only about 200 billion into things that are positive investments in nature around the world. And these numbers are a couple of years old now, and I think the latest version will come out at the beginning of December. So we might see updates in these numbers. But the key picture is that at the moment we're seeing finance flowing into things more that are having a negative impact on nature, and a relatively small flows into things that are having a positive impact. So a lot of my work is about how do you use models to change this. So how do we use it to mobilize more finance into nature? So you can see here the goal is that we'd get to around 540 billion to meet the Rio targets by 2030. So how do we get those numbers up and reduce the 7 trillion that's damaging nature? And I think the last presentation that we saw from Tomoko particularly talks about that second bucket. So areas of afforestation and BECCS can be a really important one in terms of enhancing those positive financial flows. I'm going to focus more on the negative here. So how do we get down the negative numbers? And one of the ways that we do that is through what we call greening finance. So this is about trying to make sure that financial institutions and corporates that are having either directly or indirectly a negative impact on nature build that into their thinking, so that they account for that in the way that they're thinking about pricing different risks, different loans, different bonds, but also in how they allocate their finance across portfolios. And models play a really important role there, because they need to see what types of financial flows are most linked into damaging activities and calculate the risks associated with that. Now, integrated assessment models, I'm sure many of you will be aware, have been used particularly in this area on climate change as well. So one of the key intervention points in this area, that in the financial sector in particular, is the work that central banks and supervisors do to encourage financial institutions to price in the impacts and risks associated with climate change. And this really started around 2015 with the introduction of the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures and the subsequent policies and supervisory practices that were brought in after that. And integrated assessment models provided a really strong foundation, or a very significantly used in this space, and I'm sure many of you have seen the scenarios, for example, of the NGFS that are based on integrated assessment models, particularly looking at the different mitigation pathways and how those translate into financial risks, both transition risks, so policy risks, but also physical risks. But what we know is that there's a lot of problems in how those models are used right now. And one of the things that we've done on a more qualitative research side is actually interviewing financial institutions about how they're using these models, how they're interpreting them. And this shows some work that we did with the UK's biggest financial institutions. And what we can see is that these model-based scenarios that are being used are having a really big impact already on how financial institutions are pricing risk and how they're allocating their investments across portfolios. And they've become the NGFS scenarios have become a real standard that are used across the board, particularly amongst big financial institutions. But a lot of financial institutions really struggle to interpret these models. They have limited capacity to tailor them, and there's a lot of problems. So we know from them, for example, that they feel that actually these models don't really capture the key risks to them. So they tend to underplay the risks. So one of the things that's been on our mind as we then think about how do we bring nature into those decisions is how do we overcome this? And this is actually a slide that I produced many, many years ago, actually about 20 years ago, but things have not really improved, as I'm sure you'll be talking about in Rio. The types of risks that are captured in integrated assessment models. And we know that on the physical climate risk side, for example, they're only capturing a small portion of the risk. So they tend to capture only some of the risks that are there, particularly missing things like big tipping points issues and big extreme weather events, big cascading risks that are less certain. So this is a real challenge if you're trying to use these models to price risk, and we know this. And so looking now at nature, we know that these same things are going to happen when we're looking at nature-related risks, because a lot of the characteristics of nature-related risks are quite similar to climate-related risks. So, for example, we know that both, and so this is a comparison that we did with some work with the Network for Greening the Financial System. We know that while nature-related risks are quite localized, we know that they have global implications in the same way that climate change does. We know that they're very uncertain. We know that there are these cascading and compounding, so these non-linearities in the system that models really struggle to capture. So they struggle with these same issues that we saw in terms of climate integrated assessment models. So one of the things we've been doing is looking at how you can resolve this and coming up with a set of principles for how to do that. So how to interpret models. And these have been applied to climate change, but also now to nature-related risks as well, and learn from other areas. So I've got here an example of something that I was involved in, again, many years ago in designing the Thames barrier that protects London, where again, integrated assessment models are being used, but we need to look at how to model those uncertainties well so that we don't, in this case, design a flood defense that could lead to London flooding. So the types of principles that come out then for models is, we need to make sure these models are capturing the range of possible outcomes, that they're relevant to the decision-making context, they're up to date in terms of the scientific evidence and the economics and technologies, etc. And they capture things that are most relevant from the user perspective. And one of our assessments is that at the moment, a lot of integrated assessment models don't really tick these boxes when it comes to what financial institutions in particular need. So just to finish up, I'm going to sort of show you some of the work that we've done actually with PAULA and a number of other partners to try to capture some of these nature-related risks and the implications that they can have for finance. And again, why is this so important is because if you're not calculating these risks properly, it can mean that finance, these risks are not priced into finance, and finance continues to flow to things that can be damaging to nature. So one of the things we did then is a scenario-based analysis using combining narrative scenarios and then connecting those with integrated assessment models. And we used a very sort of collaborative approach. So we defined storylines to do this. And this one is an example of an international supply chain shock scenario. Looking at how degradation of nature, so things like changes in water quality, in soil health, pollinators, fisheries, biofuels, but also how that links into public debt levels, and then big shocks like breadbasket failure scenarios. So we built these narrative storyline scenarios, and then we connect those to the integrated assessment models, both in a sort of qualitative and a quantitative sense. And just to sort of finish off, what we found then in an example for the UK is when you capture these wider things that aren't usually captured in integrated assessment models, you get quite big impacts. And this is really important because a lot of the work to date had come up with relatively small financial impacts of maybe sort of less than 1% of GDP because they're missing some of these really big drivers. But this study was quite unique in capturing these wider issues. And what we find for the UK, for example, is you can get losses to GDP in the UK of between about 6 and 12%, depending on the scenario. And then when you include climate change on top of that, as we did on the left-hand side of this figure, in those orange bars, the climate change impact on top of that and the compounding of the two leads to even greater impacts. So this is just an example then of how integrated assessment models are being used in a different area within finance, some of the challenges and some of the ways that we're working with the scientific community, the economic community, integrated assessment modeling community to try and overcome some of these challenges and provide the data that financial institutions need. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. And now I'll open the floor to questions. So we have PAULA, Tomoko, and Nicola here. Any questions?
Hi, thank you for the interesting presentations. I had one question for Nicola, just like on the last slide, this study you were speaking to. I was wondering, did you make any like uncertainty like kind of analysis with these risks? And yeah, if you could speak to that a bit.
Sure. So uncertainty definitely, but in different ways. So the way that financial institutions often look at these issues is through a stress testing lens. So they're trying to capture, what it's very sort of what if scenarios. So they want to know what if something happens, how big an impact will that have? And that actually means that they tend to want to see more extreme scenarios captured. So these are not predictions. Remember, these is looking at a what if scenario. If under these circumstances, how could that play out for financial institutions? And that way of approaching these problems in stress testing is very codified. So, for example, in the way that the ECB or the Bank of England or the Banco do Brazil as well looks at this, is very codified how they talk about these scenarios. So in some senses, we're not aiming for precision. So the way that we look at uncertainty is slightly different. But certainly the way that we look at uncertainty is really testing those assumptions. So looking at sensitivity analysis around the core assumptions, seeing how sensitive the outcomes are to those different assumptions that we're putting in, and really testing that with users as well.